August 18th, 1987, outside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, a brother and sister walk out together, arms around each other, into a crowd of reporters. Weeks earlier, the brother had walked into that same building and asked a judge to take his sister's 12-year-old son away from her, to make himself the boy's permanent guardian, because he did not believe she could keep the child safe. She had just come out of drug treatment and had spent the weeks since fighting him for her son in open court. Now it is over. He has withdrawn the request, and the two of them come down the courthouse steps, not as opponents, but as family again, her arm around the brother who had tried to take her child, as she lifts a hand toward the cameras in a small sign of victory and says 3 words: Sam's coming home. The name at the center of that scene had meant one thing to America for more than a decade: the perfect family. It belonged to the household the country had watched on television and agreed to treat as the model of what a home should be: wholesome, intact, happy. That was the public image. What had gone on behind it was a different story, one building for years before it ever reached the courtroom. This is the private history of that family. 2 famous American families joined by a single marriage, 4 children raised inside a manufactured image, and a run of catastrophes over more than 20 years. The addiction, the slow collapse of the marriage, a father dead at 45 in a burning airplane, and it is the story of what became of those 4 children, where all of it left them, and what each chose to do with the name. To understand how a woman came to stand on those courthouse steps, married for the better part of 2 decades into one American legend, then fighting her own younger brother over the boy who carried its name, you have to go back to a time before those 2 families had ever collided. You have to go back to Burbank, California, in the years after the Second World War, and to a little girl who was born into achievement the way other children are born into a language. Her name was Sharon Kristin Harmon, and long before she was anyone's cautionary tale, she was the eldest daughter of a household the country already believed it knew. Because here is the thing most people got wrong about Kristen Nelson from the very beginning. They assumed she had married up, that some ordinary young woman had been plucked out of nowhere and set down inside America's most famous television family. That was never true. Kristen had grown up famous before she ever met a Nelson. Her father was Tom Harmon, the University of Michigan halfback, who won the Heisman Trophy in 1940 and then became one of the most recognizable voices in American sports broadcasting. He was also a man whose survival had already passed into legend before his daughter was born. Shot down twice during the war, given up for dead, and walking out alive both times. Her mother was Elise Knox, an actress and a model whose face had sold magazines and appeared in studio pictures throughout the 1940s. Kristen was born on June 25th, 1945, the first of their 3 children. Her younger sister, Kelly, would model and act. Her younger brother, born in 1951, was named Mark. So the daughter did not enter celebrity when she fell in love. She was raised inside it. She grew up in a house organized around competition and accomplishment, and the particular pressure of a name that people recognized before they knew anything else about you. Decades later, when she finally told her own story, she framed the whole of her childhood around exactly those 3 words: competition, achievement, and celebrity, as though they were the weather she had grown up under. There is something about that detail worth sitting with, because it changes the shape of everything that came after. The woman the tabloids would eventually describe as a fallen Hollywood wife had never once known a private life. She was a public child who became a public bride, who became a public mother. And somewhere very early, before any of the rest of it, she went looking for something that would be only hers. She found it in paint. In 1962, when she was 17, Kristen was inside the home of the family she would soon marry into, and she saw a group of American primitive paintings hanging on the wall. Picture her there for a moment, a teenage girl, not yet married, standing in Ozzie and Harriet Nelson's living room, looking at pictures made by people with no training and no interest in being admired. Something about them stopped her. These were not the polished society portraits she had grown up around. They were flat, plain, unschooled, honest in a way that had nothing to do with performance. In a life that had been curated since before she could remember, here was a thing that did not care how it looked. She began painting that year. She was not yet a Nelson. She was not yet a mother. She had not yet lived a single one of the years the public would later use to define her. But she had already found a private language she would return to for the rest of her life. The one she would use again and again to say the things she could not seem to organize out loud. 35 years later, that instinct would become a book, an illustrated autobiography, her paintings set beside her own account of a life that too many other people had already narrated for her. Remember that. Before television ever absorbed her into someone else's picture of a happy family, Kristin Harmon was already trying to build a self that would survive it. The family she was about to join had built something no American family had built before. And to understand what happened to Kristin, you have to understand exactly what that was. Ozzie Nelson had been a band leader. His wife, Harriet Hilliard, had been a singer. Together, first on the radio and then on television, they did something that now sounds almost impossible. They turned their own domestic life into a national entertainment. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet moved to ABC television in 1952 and ran for 14 seasons. Until 1966, 435 episodes in all. The Nelsons played themselves. Ozzie and Harriet played Ozzie and Harriet. Their two sons, David and Ricky, played David and Ricky. The production even reproduced the family's real Los Angeles home as the show's principal set, so that the line between where the Nelsons actually lived and where the Nelsons pretended to live was deliberately, almost eerily, blurred. The result was larger than a television program. Ozzie and Harriet became a kind of national shorthand. The phrase people reached for when they wanted to describe the idealized post-war family. The wholesome and upright household America told itself it was supposed to want. Millions of people watched two boys grow up inside that frame, week after week, year after year, and the younger boy became something his parents had never planned for. Ricky Nelson was the child the cameras had raised, and when rock and roll arrived, he turned the familiarity of that upbringing into a real musical career. Audiences already believed they knew him. He had grown up in their living rooms, but the boy next door became a serious recording artist. And the tension between those two things, Ricky the television son and Rick the musician who wanted to be taken seriously, would follow him for the rest of his life. Long after his death, he would be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the class of 1987. He never saw it. This was the young man Kristin Harmon married. They were married on April 20th, 1963, at St. Martin of Tours Catholic Church in Los Angeles. Rick was 22. Kristin was 17. Her 18th birthday was still 2 months away, and though some later profiles would round her up to 18, the dates are plain. She was a teenager on her wedding day. 6 months later, on October the 25th, 1963, in Santa Monica, she gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Tracy Christine Nelson. Kristin had just turned 18. Consider the speed of that. In the space of a single year, a 17-year-old became a wife, became a mother, and became a cast member, because marrying Rick meant joining the show. Kristin was written into the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet as a regular, playing a version of herself, the young wife who had married into America's favorite family. There was no clean line between her home and the product. The real daughter-in-law became the televised daughter-in-law. The private marriage became, from almost its first day, a public one. You have to understand what that meant to actually live. A newlywed learns marriage the way everyone learns it, clumsily, privately, in the small daily negotiations that no one else should ever see. Kristin was learning it while also performing a polished version of it for a camera. Standing on a set built to look like a home, playing the contented young wife in a family the whole country had decided was the picture of contentment. The real marriage and the scripted one were happening in the same weeks, sometimes on the same days. She was 18. She was rehearsing happiness professionally while trying to find the actual thing at home. It is hard to imagine a stranger apprenticeship into adult life. That is the first thing to understand about the machinery Kristin had walked into. She was not simply expected to adjust to a young marriage, to motherhood, to life with a touring musician. She had married into a family whose entire fame rested on selling a flawless version of exactly the thing she was now trying to actually live. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. By the end, there would be 6 people at the center of this story, and it helps to know who they were before the story broke them. There was Kristin herself, expressive, artistic, raised around achievement, forever reaching for a self that would not dissolve into the Nelson name. There was Rick, a man who had essentially never known privacy, whose whole adult project was to be seen as more than the boy the country remembered. There was Tracy, born in 1963, the only child old enough to hold real memories of the family while the myth was still fresh, who would grow up to be an actress in her own right. There were the twins, Matthew and Gunnar, born on September 20th, 1967, who would eventually turn the family inheritance toward music. And there was Sam, born in 1974, so much younger than the others that he would come to experience the family less as a household than as a set of arrangements. A boy for whom the central question would not be who his parents were, but where he was allowed to live. 4 children, one marriage, and beneath all of it, the same ache running through nearly every person in the family, the effort to become someone independent of a famous name while never being allowed to put it down. For a while, and this matters, it worked. The early years of the marriage deserve to be remembered as something other than a prologue to ruin, because for a stretch of time, they were simply a life. Kristin was not yet the woman the public would later reduce to a treatment clinic and a custody file. She was a young mother in Los Angeles raising children, acting and painting, always painting. And her art was not a hobby anyone was humoring. It became real. Over the years, her work drew serious collectors. Jacqueline Kennedy bought one of her paintings. So, in time, did the actress Mia Farrow and Tyne Daly and the musician Dwight Yoakam. The woman who had found her private language at 17 had turned it into something the world was willing to pay for. Rick, meanwhile, was doing the harder version of the same thing, trying to grow out of the image that had made him. He did not want to be a nostalgia act, a grown man performing the memory of a boy. He wanted the music to stand on its own. That was a lonelier ambition than it sounds. The audiences who came to see him carried a picture of Ricky in their heads, the smiling teenager from the television set, and they wanted that boy delivered back to them intact. Every night he had to walk out and be a man they were determined to remember as a child. Some of the music broke through that anyway. And in the trying, he spent more and more of his life where touring musicians spend it, on the road, in other cities, moving between stages and hotels and airports while his wife raised their children in the house they shared in the hills above Los Angeles. The absence was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. A man cannot be in a recording studio in one city and at a kitchen table in another. And Rick had chosen, understandably, to fight for the career. The cost of that choice was paid quietly at home, and it was paid mostly by Kristin and by 4 children who learned early that their father was someone who arrived and then left again. The household kept growing. After Tracy came the twins Matthew and Gunnar on September 20th, 1967. And then, 7 years later, in 1974, came Sam. That spread of years, at 11 of them from the first child to the last, is one of the most important facts in the entire story. And it is easy to miss. It meant that when the marriage finally came apart, the 4 children would not be standing in the same place. One would be nearly grown. 2 would be half-formed adolescents. 1 would be barely out of infancy. They would not share a single-family collapse. They would each get their own version of it, calibrated exactly to how old they were when the ground moved. For a time, though, before any of that arithmetic came due, there was simply a family growing up in a house in the hills, a mother who painted while her children slept, a daughter old enough to be a little person now, with opinions and a face that was starting to look like her mother's. 2 identical boys inventing a private world that only the 2 of them would ever fully enter, and a father who, when he was home, was by many accounts a warm and gentle presence. Not the disciplinarian of the era, but the softer parent, the one who came back from the road carrying the particular tenderness of a man who has missed his children. It was not nothing. It was for whole stretches a good life. That is what makes the rest of it hard to tell. There is a kind of image that survives from these years, the family photograph, the publicity still, the frame in which Rick and Kristin and their children are arranged into something that looks whole. It is tempting to look at a picture like that and call it a lie. It was not a lie. That is the harder truth. A photograph can hold 6 people in a coherent arrangement, everyone accounted for, everyone in place. At the precise moment when the actual family is beginning to pull apart along a dozen invisible seams, the touring, the distance, the pressure, the substances that were quietly becoming part of the household, the photograph is not false. It is simply incapable of holding what a family actually is. It freezes the one thing a family cannot do: stay still. Because underneath the construction, something was shifting. Years later, Kristin would describe this period with an unusual bluntness. By her own account, she and Rick had become part of the drug culture that surrounded their world. She called the 2 of them, in an interview she gave in 1987, hippie rock and rollers, and she said that in time both of them were badly affected by it. This is the point where the story most often gets distorted, so it is worth being precise about what she actually said. She did not describe a clean husband living beside an inexplicably broken wife. She described something mutual. She said she eventually sought out therapy. She said Rick took part only briefly. But the drift into that world, by her telling, belonged to both of them. There is a bitter symmetry in that. Both Rick and Kristin had grown up as products, children whose lives were managed, arranged, presented. The counterculture of their era offered what looked like the opposite: freedom, release, and escape from all that image management. And the thing that promised to free them became instead one more force, pulling the household off its foundation. What looked like rebellion turned out to be one more kind of instability. The children were registering all of it, each in their own key. For the twins, the memory would stay sharp into adulthood. Decades later, in a memoir published in December of 2025, and in the interviews that surrounded it, Matthew and Gunnar Nelson would describe a childhood that was emphatically not the one their family had sold to America. They wrote about their mother's alcoholism. They wrote about their parents' divorce and about their father's death. These are the recollections of men looking back across 40 years, and they should be held as exactly that. Memory, not surveillance footage, but they come from inside the house. And what they describe is the strange inheritance of being a Nelson grandchild, growing up beneath a national symbol of the perfect family, while the actual family around you came apart. For Sam, still a small child, there was no myth to measure anything against. There was only the concrete texture of it. Which adult had him, where he was sleeping when he was allowed to see his father. His age would eventually make the geography of the family the whole shape of his childhood. Hold the two things in your mind at once. On one screen, a restored episode of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. The tidy living room, the gentle plot, the family that always resolves before the closing credits. On the other, the actual grandchildren of that show, grown men now, describing a home that did not resolve. The point of holding those two images together is not to accuse Ozzie and Harriet of lying. The show was full of real affection and real faces. The point is quieter and sadder than that. America had been handed an idea of what a family was supposed to look like, and that idea had been built out of one specific family. And that family's own descendants would spend their adult lives explaining that they had never actually lived inside it. By the middle of the 1970s, the marriage that had begun with a 17-year-old bride and a 6-month-old pregnancy was more than a decade old, and it was tired in the way that only a long marriage under constant pressure can be. The exact chronology of what happened next survives mostly in biographies rather than in easily accessible court records, so it should be held a little loosely. But by several accounts, in 1977, Kristin filed for divorce, and then for a time, she took it back. The reconciliation is the part people forget, and it is the part that matters most because it tells you what kind of marriage this was. This was not a clean break. It was not two people who had simply stopped loving each other and walked calmly in opposite directions. It was a marriage that had crossed the line from private unhappiness into a formal legal rupture, and then stepped back over that line and tried to be a marriage again. That first filing in 1977 was the fracture. Not because it ended anything. It did not, Betsy, but because it was the first time the private trouble became a matter of record. For years, the difficulty had lived inside the house, absorbed by routine, hidden behind the photographs and the touring schedule and the work. Now it had a date on it. Now there was a document. And the 4 children were, at that moment, in 4 completely different places. Tracy was 13, going on 14, old enough to understand exactly what a divorce filing was, old enough to feel the specific shame of a family crisis when your family is one the whole country believes it knows. She was the child with the longest memory of the household as it had once been, which meant she had the most to lose from watching it change. The twins were 9, maybe 10, old enough to feel the temperature of the house drop, to register the tension between their parents, but not yet old enough to have the language for it. They had each other, which would turn out to be the great fact of both their lives. Whatever the house did, they did it together. And Sam was 3. He would remember none of this directly, and what it meant for him was more insidious than memory. It meant the instability began so early that he would never have a stable version of the family to measure anything against. For his older siblings, the divorce filing was the moment the house changed. For Sam, the changed house was simply the house. He was born into the fracture. For Rick and Kristin, the filing and the reconciliation together became the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of their years. A marriage that could neither fully hold nor fully end. 2 people bound by 4 children and nearly a decade and a half of shared life, pulling apart and back together, while the substances and the distance and the exhaustion did their quiet work underneath. And almost none of it was visible from the outside. That was the cruelest efficiency of the name. The same public image that had once made the Nelson famous now worked to conceal what was happening to them. To the world, they were still Ozzie and Harriet's boy and his pretty young wife from the show. The magazines had their version of this family, and the version was durable, and it did not include a divorce filing quietly withdrawn. The private reality and the public image had come completely apart, and for now, the public image was still winning. There was a pattern underneath all of this that had been there from the very start. Kristin had spent her entire life inside images of the ideal family, first as the daughter of one famous household, then as the daughter-in-law of the most famous fictional household in the country. She had married at 17 into a machine built to broadcast domestic perfection, and now she was living the one thing that machine had no way to show: a real marriage, failing slowly, inside a family the entire nation had been taught to hold up as the standard for what a family should be. There was no room in that picture for what was actually happening. So the actual thing happened anyway, off camera, in a house full of children who were each either too young or too close to see the whole of it. A reconciliation can restore a household on paper. It can put two names back on the same address. What it cannot do is restore the conditions that made the household possible in the first place. The trust, the presence, the version of two people who had not yet done this to each other. Kristin took the filing back. The marriage went on, but the thing that had made her file did not go anywhere. By 1980, it would all be heading back toward a courtroom. And this time, the children would not be spared the watching. This time, they would begin to live it. The second time, there was no reconciliation waiting on the other side. Around 1980, Kristin filed again, and this time the marriage did not step back from the edge. The proceedings moved the way these things move when there are 4 children and nearly 2 decades of a shared life to divide. Slowly, and with a kind of grinding attrition, and the divorce was not final until December of 1982. By then, Rick and Kristin had been married for 19 years, almost the entire span of Kristin's adult life. She had married him as a 17-year-old. She was 37 when it ended. The children were, once again, in 4 different places, but they had grown, and the distances between them had widened. Tracy was 17 when her mother refiled, and 19 by the time the divorce was finalized. Old enough now to begin building a life with its own center of gravity, a young woman moving toward a career of her own. The twins were 13 at the start of it and 15 by the end, deep in the years when a boy most needs a solid house to push against, and finding instead a house that was coming apart under his feet. And Sam was 6 when the second divorce began and 8 when it concluded. For the 3 older children, the divorce was something happening to their family. For Sam, the divorce became a map. This is the detail that matters most about the youngest child, and it is easy to pass over. Sam did not experience his parents' separation as a single event with a clean before and after. He experienced it as a series of relocations. Stretches living with his maternal grandparents, Tom and Elise Harmon, the football hero and the actress, now grown old enough to be the steady ground the marriage could not provide. Seeing his own father became something that had to be arranged rather than assumed, an event rather than an ordinary weekday. For an elementary school child, your parents are getting divorced did not arrive as a conversation. It arrived as a question of which adult had him this week, and where he would sleep, and when he might get to see his dad. The people who kept him steady through it were his grandparents, and in time his uncle, Kristin's younger brother, Mark. Hold on to that name. It will matter enormously before this is over. And picture what a visit with his father actually was for a boy in that situation. Not the easy, unremarked presence of a dad who is simply around. The ride to school, the familiar shape at the kitchen table on an ordinary morning, but something rarer and therefore heavier. An afternoon, a burger somewhere, or an ice cream. A gathering at the family's house in the hills at Christmas. For a child who saw his father in scheduled pieces, these ordinary things stop being ordinary. Scarcity does that. It takes the plainest father-son afternoon and turns it into an occasion, into something a boy carries around afterward and takes out to look at again, because he does not know when the next one is coming. Kristin's own years in this stretch are harder to reconstruct with precision, and where the record is thin, it is more honest to say so than to invent. By her own later accounts, this was a period in which she was reaching for help. Alcoholics Anonymous, treatment, the slow and non-linear work of trying to get sober, the exact chronology of when she was struggling and when she was steady, of what she used and when she stopped, shifts from one retelling to another, and much of it survives only in her own retrospective account rather than in any public medical record. What can be said plainly is this: the woman who had spent her whole life inside pictures of the ideal family was, by the early 1980s, a newly divorced mother of four, fighting something that does not keep to a schedule. And here, the four threads begin to pull genuinely apart because each child was finding a different way out of the same house. Tracy went toward acting, the family's original medium, the thing the Nelsons had always done, but on her own terms, building a career rather than simply carrying a name. The twins went toward music, which was the deeper inheritance, the thing their father had made his entire life. Matthew and Gunnar had been writing songs together since they were small. The bond between them was the kind that seems to belong only to identical twins, a private country with a population of two, and music was its language. Picture the two of them in the shifting years of that divorce, a bedroom or a garage, one of them working out a melody while the other found the harmony without having to be told. The two voices folding into each other the way they had since before either of them could remember. In a childhood that kept moving underneath them, the one thing that stayed put was each other, and the one thing they could build with their own hands was a song. They did not reject the Nelson name. They decided in the end that they would carry it, that they would prove they could do the thing their father did and do it as themselves. And Sam, the youngest, the one the divorce had turned into a traveler, would find his own way too. But that was years off, and it would be the strangest and most fitting path of all. In the early 1980s, he was still just a small boy trying to see his father. From the outside, through all of this, the family still wore the name. To the public, they were still the Nelsons, Ozzie and Harriet's boy and his children, the second and third generations of the household America had adopted as its own. The magazine still ran the old warmth. What the name concealed was that the four people carrying it were, by the early 1980s, largely improvising their own survival. An oldest daughter building a career, two teenage boys building a private world out of music, a small boy being handed among the adults who loved him, and a mother fighting to stay on her feet. The picture held. The family behind it was quietly rearranging itself around the empty place where a stable home was supposed to be. Which brings us to the last full year that Rick Nelson was alive, and to 3 encounters the family would spend the rest of their lives holding on to. By December of 1985, Rick was 45 years old and still doing the thing he had always done, playing shows, moving between cities, chasing the version of himself that got to be a musician and not a memory. His twin sons were 18 now, no longer children, beginning the exact passage he had once made himself, from somebody's kid to an artist in his own right. In the last weeks of that year, according to what Matthew and Gunnar have said in the decades since, most fully in a memoir they published in December of 2025, 40 years after the fact, their father came to watch their band play. This is their memory, offered from the far side of 4 decades, and it belongs to them. It is not a fact certified by anyone else. But by their account, Rick stood and watched his 18-year-old sons perform, and afterward he told them he was proud of them, not as his children, but as musicians. For a man who had spent his whole life trying to be taken seriously as one, it was close to the highest thing he had to give. And by their telling, at the last moment, when it came time to fly on, he did not bring them aboard his plane. They stayed behind. He went on without them. There is something about that worth sitting with, though carefully, because the temptation is to turn it into an omen, and it was not an omen. It was a father near the end of a long year, seeing his grown sons and being proud of them. That is all anyone understood it to be at the time. Only later would it become the last time. In the interviews around their book, the twins have also spoken of a final phone call with their father in those last days. The small, unremarkable words of a conversation you have no way of knowing will be your last. That too is theirs to tell, and they have told it as the kind of ordinary goodbye that only becomes unbearable in hindsight, when you learn there will be no next one. The younger memory belongs to Sam, and it is smaller and more ordinary, which is exactly why it lasted. On Christmas Day of 1985, Sam was 11 years old. His father gave him a present, a remote-controlled car. Somewhere in that day, someone took a photograph of the two of them, father and son, with the toy between them. By the accounts the family has given since, it was the last picture ever taken of Rick and his youngest child together. There was no goodbye in it. That is the thing about the photograph. It was not a farewell. It was a Christmas, a boy and his dad and a new toy, one more visit in a childhood that had already learned to count them. Sam had grown up knowing the time with his father was a limited quantity. He had no way of knowing he had just spent the last of it. 6 days later, on the last afternoon of the year, Rick's band and the people traveling with them boarded his airplane. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-3, an old and storied model, registration number N711 the kind of plane that had been carrying band leaders and their musicians around the country since before Rick was born. Now it carried him from show to show. He had been out on the road through the holidays, playing the small halls and clubs of the South. A different town at most nights. The band, the equipment, the long transits in between. The ordinary grind of a working musician in his 40s who had never stopped working. He was in fact flying toward one more show that night. A New Year's Eve performance in Dallas, the last date on a calendar that had never really let up. On the afternoon of December 31st, 1985, the plane left Guntersville, Alabama at 12:40 in the afternoon local time on an instrument flight plan bound for Texas. Aboard were Rick, his fiancée, Helen Blair, and members of his band, the small traveling world that made up a touring musician's working life. Understand what that airplane was because it changes how you see this. It was not a symbol of excess. For a man who spent his life on the road, a private plane was not a luxury. It was infrastructure, the thing that got you from a stage in one state to a stage in another, the ordinary machinery of the job. On the last day of 1985, Rick Nelson boarded his plane the way a commuter boards a train, because that was the shape his life had taken, and had taken for years. It was New Year's Eve. He had a show to play. There is nothing in any of that which suggests an ending. That is the point. The weather did not warn anyone. This is one of the hardest facts in the whole story, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The sky over northeast Texas that afternoon was clear. It was daylight. Visibility ran to 15 miles. There was no precipitation, no storm, nothing outside the aircraft to announce that anything was wrong. The temperature stood at around 18 degrees. By every measure a pilot watches, it was an ordinary and benign afternoon to be flying. The danger was not outside the plane. It was inside it. At some point during the flight, a fire began aboard the aircraft. The federal record that survives and the factual report of the investigation that followed establishes what can be established: an in-flight fire and then a forced landing. The precise origin of that fire would become a matter of investigation and later of argument, and it is not the place of an honest account to reach past the evidence and name a cause the record never settled. What is not in dispute is what the fire did. The two pilots brought the burning aircraft down out of that clear sky, away from any runway, into the countryside near DeKalb, Texas. The forced landing came at 14 minutes past 5 in the evening local time. The airplane was destroyed. Of the 9 people aboard, the 2 pilots at the controls survived, both of them seriously injured. The 7 passengers in the cabin did not. Rick Nelson was one of them. He was 45 years old. That is the fact, and it does not need adornment. A clear sky, 15 miles of visibility, an ordinary flight between 2 shows on the last afternoon of the year, and inside the machine moving through that calm air, a catastrophe. The calm air gave no sign of. Do not imagine more than that. No one can honestly say what Rick saw in his last minutes, or what he said, or what he thought, and the people who might have known are the ones who did not come back. The record gives us the outside of the event. The time, the place, the weather, the aircraft, the outcome. The inside of it belongs to the 7 people who were there, and it went with them. Word of it spread across the country on the one night designed for celebration. Before midnight on New Year's Eve, radio and television began carrying the news that Rick Nelson, Ricky, the boy America had watched grow up in its living rooms, the teenage idol who had become a man on a stage and had died in a plane crash in a Texas field. A generation that had known him as a child on a Friday night television show learned, on the last night of 1985, that he was gone at 45. The public that had watched him grow up got to grieve him first, in a way, before some of the people who had actually raised him and been raised by him even fully understood what had happened. There is a particular strangeness to that timing that never quite goes away. Across the country, people were pouring drinks and counting down the last minutes of the year, and threaded through all of it, on the radio and the late broadcasts, was the news that the boy from the show was dead. For a whole generation, the last night of 1985 would carry a second memory underneath the confetti and the noise, the moment they heard it and did not quite believe it, that Ricky Nelson, of all people, the one who had always been young, was gone at 45. Because the news reached the family the way this kind of news always reaches families, by phone in pieces on the last night of the year, while the rest of the country counted down to a new one. Matthew and Gunnar were 18. Days earlier, their father had watched them play and told him he was proud of them as musicians. Now he was gone. At the precise moment fatherhood had begun turning into something like partnership, that they have described the shock of it in the years since as a physical thing, the kind of loss that takes the floor out from under you. The career they would go on to build can be understood, in part, as an answer to a conversation that death had cut off in the middle. How do you become your own musician when the musician who was also your father dies exactly as he begins to treat you as a peer? Sam was 11. 6 days earlier, he had opened a Christmas present from his father and posed for a photograph with it. Now the intermittent father that divorce had already made scarce was gone completely. Not away on the road this time, not at the far end of an arrangement, but gone in the permanent way that an 11-year-old can barely hold in his hands. Tracy was 22, the oldest, the one with the longest continuous memory of the family as it had first been, already working as an actress. She had known the household before it fractured. Now the man at the center of that first memory was dead. And Kristin was 40. She had been divorced from Rick for 3 years. Whatever had gone wrong between them, the drift, the substances, the two filings, the long, slow coming apart, she was bound to him permanently now, through 4 children and nearly 2 decades of a shared life, in the particular way that only the death of someone you once married can bind you. Whatever future might once have existed, in which the two of them, older and steadier, found some workable peace as the parents of the same 4 children, that future was gone. There would be no repaired co-parenting. There would be no wiser, calmer Rick for Sam to come to know as a grown man. The door on all of it had closed in a field in Texas at 14 minutes past 5. In the first days of 1986, the family gathered to bury him. Rick was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, in the city where the whole story had started, where a bandleader and a singer had once turned their own household into a television show. His father, Ozzie, had died a decade earlier, in 1975. His mother, Harriet, the Harriet, one half of the name that had come to mean the American family, was still living, and now in her 70s, she had to do the one thing no parent is built to do and bury her younger son. The boy the whole country had watched grow up was mourned by the whole country. But it was the 4 children who stood at the actual graveside. Whatever the public felt from a distance, they were the ones who had lost a father, and they had to lose him in front of everyone. For Kristin, the timing carried its own cruelty. She was a woman in the middle of trying to save herself, reaching for sobriety, for steadiness, for some version of a life she could stand inside. And now she had to keep reaching, while grieving the father of her children, and while raising or trying to raise a grieving 11-year-old. Grief is heavy for anyone. It is heavier when you are already carrying something that threatens to pull you under, and heavier still when the smallest and most watchful pair of eyes in the family is turned toward you, checking to see whether the ground is going to hold. And then, into the middle of the family's grief, came a second injury that had nothing to do with the fire. In the days and weeks after the crash, a story began to move through the public about what had supposedly been happening aboard that plane. A rumor about drugs, and about the cause of the fire, ugly and specific, that fastened itself to Rick Nelson's death, almost before his children had finished absorbing that he was dead. It is not necessary to repeat the details of that rumor, and this account will not dwell on them, because its real place in this story is not as a theory about the crash. The federal accident record identifies the event as a fire, in the air and then on the ground, following the forced landing. The rumor's place in the story is as a weight the surviving family was made to carry. Rick's children would spend decades of their lives pushing back against it. Consider what that means. To be 18 or 11 and to lose your father, and then to watch a version of his death you believe to be false hardened into the public version, repeated and repeated while you are still learning how to grieve him at all. The fire took Rick once. The rumor made his children lose him again, in public, every time it was told. For all 4 of them, their father's death was the event that reorganized everything else. It did not stand apart from the family's other troubles. It pressed down on all of them at once. Every unresolved thing, the divorce that had never healed into anything workable, Kristin's fight to get and stay sober, the question of who could give the youngest child a stable home. Every one of those things now had to be carried without the one person whose continued presence might, in time, have eased some of them. And in the middle of all of it stood an 11-year-old boy with a remote-controlled car and a photograph, trying to make sense of a father who had already been half absent and was now entirely gone. Sam's home had broken apart before he was old enough to understand it. The adults who loved him were struggling, his mother with her sobriety, the whole family with its grief. He was the youngest by far, the one with the least say over where he lived or with whom. The one for whom the family's chaos was not the memory of a better time, but simply the water he had always swum in. He did not know it yet, but the hardest year of his childhood would not be the one in which his father died. It would be the one that came next. Because Rick's death had ended one story. For his youngest son, it was about to begin another, a fight carried out in public in a courtroom over a single question that no 11-year-old should ever have to hear asked aloud. Which of the adults who loved him was actually fit to raise him? The question did not stay private for long. By the summer of 1987, it had a courtroom, a case number, and an audience. By June of that year, Kristin had completed a formal drug treatment program. That much is documented, and it matters because it means the crisis had been real, and she had taken a real step toward answering it. But completing treatment and being ready to raise a 12-year-old on your own are not the same thing. And the people around Sam were frightened. On the 22nd of June 1987, Kristin's younger brother, Mark Harmon, and his wife, the actress Pam Dauber, were granted temporary custody of Sam. And Mark did not stop there. He asked the court to make it permanent. Understand who Mark Harmon was by 1987 because it sharpens all of it. He was no longer simply Kristin's little brother, the youngest of the 3 Harmon children who had grown up in that house, full of achievement in Burbank. He was a famous actor in his own right, a man with his own carefully guarded public image, and he was about to spend some of that image in open court, arguing that his own sister could not be trusted to raise her own son. This was not a quiet family disagreement worked out behind closed doors. It was one of television's most recognizable extended families. The Harmons and the Nelsons, 2 American dynasties joined by a single marriage, dragging its most painful private question into a public proceeding. What was actually said in that courtroom has to be handled with care, because a custody fight is an adversarial process, and the things people say inside one are arguments, not established facts. By the contemporary reporting, Mark's side raised concerns about Kristin's fitness as a parent, concerns that, according to that reporting, touched on a dependency involving prescription drugs. Kristin disputed the case that was made against her. What is documented and not in dispute is that there had been a real crisis and a real course of treatment. What each side alleged about the other belongs to each side, and an honest account leaves it there, rather than promoting one family member's accusation into settled truth. For most of that summer then, Sam did not live with his mother. From late June, he was in the custody of his uncle and aunt, while the case moved through the Los Angeles County court system, the same court system any family uses when it comes apart over a child, except that this family's turn through it was covered in the newspapers. That is the detail that makes this its own particular kind of hard. When an ordinary family fractures over a child, the fight is at least private. The shame, if there is any, stays contained. The Nelsons and the Harmons had no such mercy. Every step of it, the treatment, the temporary custody, the petition, the hearings, the boys shuttling between houses again, was reportable, and it was reported. The name that had opened every door the family ever walked through now guaranteed that its worst weeks would be public property. The proceeding turned ugly in the particular way these things do when the people fighting love the same child and love him differently. It does not need to be reconstructed accusation by accusation, and it will not be here. The core of it is devastating enough on its own. A woman who had just come out of treatment, fighting her own brother in public for her youngest son, and a brother who believed rightly or wrongly that he was protecting a boy who could not protect himself. There were no villains in that courtroom. There were people who loved the child and could not agree on what loving him required. And it was not only the 2 of them. Somewhere off to the side of that fight stood the other 3 children, Tracy and the twins, watching their mother and their uncle, 2 people they loved, argue in front of the world about whether their family was safe. The older siblings had spent their whole lives learning to hold the family together across its fractures. Now the fracture had a courthouse address. Whatever they felt, they had learned long before how to feel it quietly and in public. And Sam was not an abstraction in any of it. He was 12 years old, and by the reporting of the time, he spoke privately during the proceedings about where he wanted to live. That is as far as an honest account can go. No narrator should pretend to know the full weight of what a 12-year-old was carrying, or the reasoning behind what he said in the middle of a public fight among the adults he loved most. What can be said is only this: a boy that age was being asked in one form or another to have a view on which of his own family could raise him. That is a great deal to lay on a child who had buried his father 18 months before. And then, on the 18th of August, 1987, it ended, not with a verdict, but with an agreement. Mark withdrew his bid for permanent custody. Kristin regained her son. Mark kept visitation, and the arrangement they reached made room for family counseling, for the idea, at least, that this was a family that intended to go on being one. After weeks of fighting over whether a mother was fit to raise her child, the two sides chose, in the end, not to let a court decide it for them. It is tempting to file that ending under one heading or the other. Either the mother was vindicated or the intervention was defeated, and neither is honest. Kristin's regaining custody was not proof that nothing had ever been wrong. She had only just come through treatment, and her brother's fear had been real, not invented. Nor did the settlement prove the whole of Mark's case. If it had been ironclad, it is not obvious he would have set it down. The more defensible way to see it is quieter than a victory or a defeat. A family in genuine crisis, having hauled its worst moment into public view, found a way to hold onto two things at once: the bond between a mother and her son, and the continued presence of the uncle, who had stepped in when he believed the boy needed him. It was not a clean ending, it was a human one, and it held. Whatever the fight had cost them, the family did not let it harden into a permanent rupture. Sam went home to his mother, but his uncle stayed in his life. The visitation and the counseling were not just words on a settlement, but the shape of the years that followed. The boy who had been the object of a public argument over whether his family could stay together grew up, in the end, with his family more or less intact around him, a mother working to stay well, an uncle who had shown, in the hardest way available, that he would step in if the boy ever needed him. It is worth saying plainly, because the tabloid shape of this story wants a permanent villain and a permanent victim, and the truth delivered neither. What it delivered was a family that fought in public over a child, and then chose to keep being a family anyway. Kristin did not disappear after that summer, and this is the part of her story the tabloid version always leaves out. She went back to the self that had existed before all of it, before the worst of the marriage, before the treatment and the courtroom, the self she had found at 17. Standing in front of a wall of primitive paintings in a living room in Los Angeles, she painted. In 1988, she married again to the television producer and director Mark Tinker. That marriage, too, would in time come apart. And in 1997, she published something quietly remarkable, an illustrated autobiography called Out of My Mind, her own painting set beside her own account of her own life. Picture the woman who made that book. In her early 50s now, a lifetime past the teenage bride on the television set, sitting down to tell the story that a show and the magazines and a courtroom had all told for her, and telling it this time in her own hand, in paint and in words. There is a particular justice in that, for a woman who had spent her whole life being looked at as the daughter of famous parents, as the daughter-in-law of the most famous family on television, as the subject of a custody case in the papers. Painting was the one place she got to be the one doing the looking. After decades of being narrated by other people, she finally got to narrate herself. And she did it in the private language she had found at 17, before any of the rest of it had touched her. The following year, the myth itself came back for the cameras. In 1998, the A&E network aired a 2-hour biography special called Ozzie and Harriet, The Adventures of America's Favorite Family. And it was there, decades after she had married into television's ideal household, that Kristin finally named the thing she had spent her life living against. She said she had spent that life fighting the fairy tale. Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it holds the whole story. The fairy tale was not a lie, in the sense that the love was fake, or the good years never happened. It was dangerous precisely because it was cherished, because a scripted family had become the standard the entire country used to measure real ones, including the real one Kristin was actually living inside, the one that could never win against a version that got to resolve every problem before the closing credits. Kristin Nelson lived her later years in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at a distance from the industry that had made and unmade her public face. She died there on the 27th of April, 2018. She was 72 years old. By the time she died, the generation that had begun all of it was long gone. Ozzie Nelson had died in 1975, 10 years before his younger son. Harriet, and the mother, the singer, the other half of the name that had come to mean the American family, outlived that son by nearly a decade. She died in 1994, having spent the last stretch of her life as the surviving keeper of a household that had turned into a national symbol, and having done the one thing she was never meant to do, which was to bury one of the two boys the whole country had watched her raise. The perfect television family in the end was subject to exactly the same arithmetic as any other. Its people grew old. Its people died. What outlasted them was the footage, and her 4 children carried the name, forward in 4 different directions, which is in the end the most interesting thing about how this story refuses to end. Their father's death and the fight that came after it did not land on the 4 of them the same way, and it did not leave them the same way either. The 2 older sons had been 18 when the plane went down, old enough to grieve as near adults and to make something of the grief. The oldest child had been 22, already at work, already building, and the youngest had been 11, then 12, dragged through a courtroom before he was old enough to drive. When a family breaks this publicly, the usual expectation is that the children scatter, that some vanish, some spiral, some sell the story. What is striking about the Nelson children is that none of them did the expected thing. Each of them, in a different medium, turned back toward the family rather than away from it. Tracy, the oldest, the one who had known the family before it broke, became an actress. Born on October 25th, 1963, she built a working television career that stretched across decades, a run on the series Square Pegs, a lead role in Father Dowling Mysteries, and a long list of credits on either side of them. She is 62 now. Reliable current reporting about her private life is thinner than it is for her brothers, and it would be dishonest to fill that quiet with invented detail. What can be said is that Tracy did the thing her mother had done before her. She took the family's original medium, acting the thing Ozzie and Harriet had built the whole dynasty on, and made a career of her own inside it rather than standing guard over an inherited name. She was the child of the 4 who stayed closest to where the story began, and who spent the least of her life explaining it. The twins are 58 now, and they never stopped. In the years right after their father's death, they did the thing grief sometimes lets you do if you are lucky enough to have somewhere to put it. They went further into the music. Matthew and Gunnar turned the deeper family inheritance into a band of their own as Nelson, and built themselves a commercial identity separate from their fathers. And here, the family did something almost no family in American music has ever done. In 1990, 5 years after the crash, Nelson reached the very top of the pop charts. It meant that Ozzie Nelson, the bandleader, and his son Rick, the teen idol, and now Rick's own twin sons, had each, across 3 generations, put a song at #1 in America. The boys who had grown up beneath the weight of the family name had at last added a line to it that was entirely their own. And alongside their own music, through their Ricky Nelson remembered performances, they became the keepers of their fathers and doing the thing he had wanted for himself and never fully received, which was to be taken seriously as a musician and then turning that same seriousness back toward him, night after night, in front of audiences who had loved him. But the largest work of their adult lives may have been quieter than any of it, and it was the work of correction. For decades, the ugly story about their father's death, the rumor that had attached itself to the crash within days, kept circulating, kept getting repeated, kept being the first thing many people thought they knew about how Rick Nelson died. And for decades, his sons pushed back against it. They gave interviews, they corrected the record, they insisted over and over on the version of their father they knew against the version the public had settled for. It is an exhausting kind of devotion, spending 40 years defending a dead man's name to strangers, and then they never put it down. In December of 2025, they did something else. They published a memoir, What Happened to Your Hair, in their own voices, revisiting the family, the childhood, the father's death, and the decades of rumor they had spent their lives correcting. The very existence of that book is part of this story's long afterlife. 40 years after a plane came down in a Texas field, the children were still working to separate what they had actually lived from the version the public had assigned them. Still, after all that time, pushing the ugly story about the crash back off their father's name. In the interviews around the book in 2026, they also spoke plainly about the practical wreckage a sudden death leaves behind. By their account, they faced roughly $4.5 million of debt in the aftermath of their father's death and chose to work through it rather than walk away from what the family had built. That figure is their own telling, family testimony, not an audited estate record, and it should be held that way, but it says something true about the inheritance a famous name actually delivered. Not a fortune, a debt, and the decision of what to do about it. And Sam, the boy in the middle of the custody fight, the 11-year-old with the remote-controlled car, the child the divorce had turned into a traveler, grew up to do the most unexpected thing of all. He became the keeper of the archive, the family's entire television record. All 435 episodes of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet has been digitally restored from the original film, negatives and audio, in association with the Nelson family. Understand the scale of that undertaking. 435 episodes is 14 years of a family's life, filmed in a home built to look like their home, running from the year before Rick met Kristin to the year after the show finally ended. Restoring it meant going back to the original negatives, cleaning and repairing them frame by frame, rescuing images that had been sitting in vaults for half a century. In 2022, UCLA screened restored episodes publicly, and in a 2025 interview, it was Sam who spoke about the work of it, the ordinary, painstaking business of running a television archive, of keeping the family's material alive and reachable for people who were not yet born when any of it happened. Sam is 51 years old now. Later this month, he turns 52. Picture him at that work, a man in his 50s bent over the restored image of his own father as a young man. The father he last saw whole when he was 11, now returned to him in clean, bright frames, 22 years old and grinning at something a writer handed him decades ago. The boy who once had to count his visits, who once had to wait for an afternoon and a burger and a photograph, now has all 435 episodes. He can find his father anytime he wants. It is not the same as having had him, but it is not nothing, and Sam has spent his adult life making sure it stays possible. Consider what that means, and how far it is from where he started. The youngest child, the one who grew up with the most fractured relationship to his famous father, who lost him at 11, whose own home became the subject of a court case, became one of the people responsible for caring for the recorded image of the family that had blurred television and reality in the first place. The archive that helped build the fairy tale became something else entirely in his hands. Not proof that the household had been perfect, but surviving footage of grandparents, of a father, of voices and gestures and ordinary afternoons that death had made unrecoverable anywhere else on earth. Of the 4 children, Sam had been handed the least, the shortest time with his father, the most broken version of the home. And he grew up to become its steward. That is where the family stands in the late summer of 2026. The 2 people at the center of the original story are gone. Rick died in 1985 at 45 in a field in Texas. Kristin died in 2018 at 72 in Santa Fe. But their 4 children are all living and all still carrying the name, each in the way they chose. Tracy is 62, an actress who built her own career, though what her days look like now she has largely kept to herself. Matthew and Gunnar are 58, still performing, and after a lifetime of being talked about, have lately become the ones doing the talking, the candid chroniclers of their own upbringing 40 years on. And Sam is 51, the keeper of the family's images, the one who turned a childhood spent being handed between houses into a life spent making sure the house on the screen does not disappear. What is worth noticing about all 4 of them is that not one of them tried to escape the name. They could have. Plenty of people born into famous, painful families change their surnames and vanish into ordinary lives, and no one would have blamed a Nelson for doing it. Instead, the twins put the name on an album cover and defended it in interviews for 4 decades. Tracy carried it into her own acting career, and Sam devoted himself to preserving the very footage that had made the name mean what it meant. They did not inherit the fairy tale so much as inherit the job of deciding what to do with it. And each of them, in a different way, decided to keep it and to tell the truth about it at the same time. The artifact at the very beginning of all of this is still here too. All 435 episodes of the constructed, perfected, beloved American family, restored, preserved, watchable. The fairy tale outlived nearly everyone who had to live behind it. There is no clean lesson here, and it would be a disservice to reach for one. It would be wrong to say fame caused the addiction, or that the television family was simply a lie. A public image can be genuinely cherished and genuinely inadequate at the same time. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet preserved real affection and the real faces of a real family, and it could never hold a divorce, an addiction, a plane crash, or what 4 children actually needed from their parents. What the Nelsons handed down was not money. It was an image and the work of deciding what to do with it. And so the honest place to end is on 435 restored episodes in which a young Ricky Nelson is forever at home, resolved before the credits roll, while his youngest son, who knows better than anyone what the camera left out, spends his life keeping those images alive.